Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics, from the American Civil War to the Korean War. On November 29, 1952, a 22-year-old CIA operative named Jack Downey was shot down over China while taking part in an airdrop. 4 successive administrations refused to acknowledge his connection to the CIA. Without this acknowledgement, Downey spent 21 years as a prisoner of war. His treatment in prison was largely dictated by the events of the Korean War and the Cold War. To discuss Jack Downey, the longest-held prisoner of war in American history, we are joined today by Barry Werth, author of Prisoner of Lies, Jack Downey's Cold War. Welcome, sir, and thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't you start us off with a biographical sketch of Downey and his recruitment by the CIA?
Jack Downey was born in 1930. The oldest of 3 kids, which means that he grew up in the Depression, and also means, more critically, that he was a teenager during World War II. That generation that came of age, particularly that generation of men that came of age right behind what we now remember as the greatest generation, had certain specific longings and drives that I think one needs to understand if one wants to understand somebody like Jack Downey. In his little narrow post-war generation, as he called it, the boys especially grew up with these tales of heroism and sacrifice that made them very eager to serve their country. Probably, as one of them said, the last generation of American males that was really driven by patriotism, but at the same time was deprived sexually. We're talking now about people who were teenagers during the war and after the war, long before the birth control pill. So they really were modeled in a certain way to want to defend America. Downey's father died when he was 8 years old, so he became the man in the family at a very young age. His mother sent him to Choate, which is a boarding school in central Connecticut, probably the fiercest of any of the elite boarding schools about building character and about molding future leaders. Jack Kennedy went to Choate, and his most famous line, of course, is, "Don't ask what America can do for you. Don't, ask what you can do for America," is cribbed directly from the headmaster at Choate, who said, "Don't ask what Choate can do for you. Ask what you can do for Choate." And Downey was an outstanding student there and also an outstanding athlete. He was the captain of the wrestling team. He was played football. He was a favorite of his teachers and fellow students, and he was a cum laude student. And he went on in 1947 to Yale as a freshman. The Yale class of 1947 was filled with people just like him who had grown up during the war and just couldn't wait to get on with to accomplish great things in their lives. Very highly driven group. He excelled at Yale. He was a leading student. He was a leading athlete. He was his class representative from his residential college. And in the summer of 1950, when war broke out in Korea, he was becoming a senior. During the semester that followed, the CIA started to recruit very heavily at Yale, as it did among the Ivy League schools. They sent numerous recruiters to campus, anticipating that these young men were going to graduate in the class of 1951, and that they would probably prefer to do some kind of highly skilled intelligence work rather than go fight in the infantry in Korea. And so the result was that Downey and up to 100 of his classmates, 10% of the Yale class of 1951, enlisted in the CIA.
Wow, that's a really incredible statistic. So he's recruited during the Korean War. And at that time, what is the CIA or Truman administration's goal when it comes to China?
The CIA was then 5 years old, and its goal towards its goal towards the communist world was to try to wage secret wars against communist regimes. It had picked up this approach from the Brits, particularly MI6. So the first of these occasions was in Albania in the late 1940s, and it was disastrous. They trained expats and former Albanian army officers to try to go back into Albania and foment a revolution against the communist government of Enver Hoxha. All of the people that they airdropped into Albania, who the Brits referred to as pixies, were captured, and a couple escaped, but almost all of the rest of them were executed, along with up to 40 members of their families in retribution. But and that particular mission into Albania was betrayed by Kim Philby, the famous British spy, the member of the Cambridge Group. So the Albanians knew where they were coming. They practically captured them when they fell out of the sky. But nonetheless, the CIA's mission during the Korean War was to wage a similar secret war against China. Again, recruit former Kuomintang fighters, anybody who was living outside of China who was disaffected enough and might want to go home enough in order to participate in a secret insurrection. And so Downey's job was to train so-called third force agents to airdrop into China and try to start a revolution against Mao's government. The third force was one specifically that was anti-communist, but was also anti-Chiang Kai-shek, who had the nationalist regime on Taiwan. That's why it was referred to as a third force. But indeed, it was a anti-communist strike force designed and led and funded by the United States, with agents who were recruited from the former Chinese military.
Tell us about Downey's mission and capture.
So they were airdropping these teams into the mountains of Manchuria. And Downey, though he spoke no English, and though he had instructed these agents with the aid of interpreters and using hand signals, had trained two groups to drop into China. The first group was supposed to land in the Forever White Mountains, 60 miles north of the Korean border, and radio out just to prove that they could do it, that they could survive there. They dropped in the first group in the summer of 1952, never heard from them again. Nonetheless, they dropped in a second group of 5 or 6 men, and almost immediately started to get radio signals back that they were on the ground and that they were starting to try to make contact with disaffected Chinese on the ground. So what they didn't know back at CIA headquarters is that Mao's troops captured these men almost immediately and substituted the radio operator and told him precisely what to say. So over the course of the next couple of months, there was a continuing communication between the Chinese on the ground and the CIA headquarters. The Chinese radioed that they had identified a former Kuomintang general who they thought might communicate with them, that they needed a courier to come in to act as an image, a go-between between the Chinese force on the ground and the CIA. And it was finally decided in the fall of 1952 to drop in this courier and then try to so-called exfiltrate him, air exfiltrate him. And the question is, how do you get somebody off the ground in China and back to CIA headquarters? The answer was what's called a snatch pickup. This was an air maneuver that was designed to take two runs at a designated site in China. The first one is to fly in low and slow, late at night, and drop a bundle that the people on the ground could assemble into a kind of a goalpost, and then fly around leaving some time to do that, and come in again, low and slow, almost at stall speed at the treetop level, and hang a hook on a cable outside of the back of the plane that would hook the courier off the ground and yank him into the aircraft, slow-moving aircraft. So imagine you're fishing for marlin. This is what it would look like. It was basically they were gonna attach the hook to the goalpost apparatus, yank this person into the air, and reel him into the plane. Downey had trained agents to do this, and at the last minute, the people who were operating the winch and hook apparatus dropped out for whatever reasons. It was never clear to Downey. And he and another CIA officer named Dick Fecteau were told that they had to do it. So on the night of November 29th, 1952, they took off from South Korea. They flew for several hours. They got to the site. They dropped the bundle, flew for an hour, came back, all prepared to pick up this courier from the ground. And as soon as they got close enough, Mao's troops removed tarps from American-made machine guns that they had, and they shot the plane out of the sky. The plane was flying at no more than 70 or 80 feet. The pilots were killed instantly. Either they turned the engine off so the plane wouldn't explode, or they brought it to level, but somehow the plane, without pilots, landed safely in a field. Downey and Fecteau tore off their parachutes, stumbled out of the plane, and were immediately surrounded by Chinese troops.
So Downey's mother is then notified that he, a civilian DoD employee, there's no acknowledgement of the CIA connection, that he died when a routine commercial aircraft crashed in the Sea of Japan. When does she find out that he is actually alive?
So Downey didn't tell his mother that he was in the CIA. He told her he was a Defense Department employee and that he was doing some work in the Far East, and he went off to the war in 1952. When the plane disappeared, initially the CIA got a message back saying that everything was fine and they were on the ground, but then there was no further report. The plane was supposed to return to South Korea and never got there. At that point, the CIA looked at the situation and thought, well, if he had been captured, the Chinese would have acknowledged that, because imagine what a prize this would be, that they captured some CIA officers in the act of trying to foment a revolution against the communist government. But when they didn't hear anything, they made up a cover story, which was that a civilian plane had disappeared over the Sea of Japan. All were lost. Downey's mother was informed that he was missing and probably dead, which she believed for the next 2 years. She took all of the pictures down off the wall. She gave all of his clothes and things to his younger brother, who was by then also at Yale. And what the Chinese were doing were biding their time. This was part of their strategy, which was to allow the United States to roll out a cover story and then at some opportune moment expose it as false. So in the fall of 1954 now, just about 2 years after Downey was shot down, Downey had a trial. It was a legitimate trial. He had representation. The Chinese produced all of this evidence, weapons, money, certificates of transfer, and the confessions of not only the Chinese agents, but also of Downey and Fecteau, that this indeed was a mission to start a secret war against the Chinese Communist government. And when they announced to the world in November of 1954 that Downey had been captured, tried, and sentenced to life, that was when Mary Downey found out that her son was alive. A reporter came. She was a school teacher in Connecticut. A reporter came to the school and said, the Chinese are announcing that somebody sounds like a John Downey was just tried and convicted, and they've announced his confession to the world. Could that be your son? And that's how she found out that he wasn't dead.
Wow. So on several occasions, the Chinese make it clear that they will release Downey if the United States acknowledges his CIA connection. Why does the United States not do that initially? And what role do John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles play in this? And I guess one more question. Why do four successive administrations then continue that charade of him being a civilian employee of the DoD?
So this war against China, as I said, was secret, and to protect its clandestine operations, the sine qua non of the CIA public policy was denial. So we had never acknowledged that we had such an operation going, and we stuck with the cover story that was invented when Downey's plane went missing. Once you start denying something, it sort of builds up a momentum of its own. Allen Dulles, being the head of the CIA, was not vocal publicly about this at all. But John Foster Dulles, who was his older brother and the Secretary of State, was the spokesman for the United States government. And when the Chinese announced that they had Downey, that they had convicted him, that he'd been sentenced to life, Dulles said, "We don't know how the Chinese came into possession of him. He was not a spy. He was a civilian employee. This is what we've come to expect from the Chinese. They never mentioned Downey Infecto before. They're lying now. We cannot negotiate any kind of release with them because what that would do would be reward a foreign hostile government for seizing wrongfully innocent American civilians." So they maintain the charade so as not to have to betray the fact that Downey, in fact, was a CIA officer on an operation to upend the Chinese government. So that lasted through the Eisenhower administration. And then Kennedy was elected. And by that time, negotiations between the two countries had completely broken down. Kennedy, who had also gone to Choate, only may have mentioned Downey 3 times during his entire presidency. When Johnson took over, we soon got into the Vietnam War, and more critically, the Chinese were immersed in the Cultural Revolution and were more or less isolated from the rest of the world. So all through that period, lasting into the early 70s, there were no channels. There was no discussion between the United States and China. We disregarded China. The only China that we recognized was the nationalist government on Formosa. So great historical developments just made it impossible to even discuss getting Downey back. Now, I should say, in the mid-1950s, right after Downey's capture was announced, the United States asked the UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld to go to China and try to negotiate the release of not just Downey Infecto, but a number of other captured flyers. But they were fighting in the Korean War, these other flyers, and therefore they had the protections of the Geneva Conventions. They really were prisoners of war because Downey Infecto were fighting a secret war. They had no such protections. And Hammarskjöld could not negotiate their release, couldn't even discuss it because the Chinese refused to privilege anything that gave the impression that somehow these captured flyers were the same as the others. So to answer your question, it went on for nearly 20 years until Nixon and Kissinger recognized the opportunity to launch an opening with China, and the Chinese insisted that this be a central part of the discussion. The Chinese said, if we are going to recognize each other's countries and governments, the United States should acknowledge and apologize for the fact that it had launched a secret invasion of us 20 years earlier.
Does the Soviet Union influence Chinese expectations or policy concerning Downey? And is this level of influence consistent over the 21 years or so of his captivity?
At various times, actually, the Russians interceded. We were talking with the Russians, and Eisenhower had asked Khrushchev specifically to see if there was anything he could do. But the Chinese were appalled, A, that we would try to invade them, B, that we would deny it, and C, that Foster Dulles would double down and accuse them of being the bad actors here. they felt that that their legal system was being challenged, their sovereignty was being challenged, and that they needed the United States to admit the truth about this before they were willing to consider sending Downey back. Now, I don't know beyond that how much the Kremlin intervened. I don't think it was much. I think this was particularly a Chinese issue, and the offense was that they felt that right and wrong and morality and immorality had been reversed, that they were the injured party, and somehow the United States was acting as if it was the injured party. So I don't think the Chinese really were influenced heavily by the Russians during that period. But I want to say one other thing, which is that twice in our history, CIA flyers have been shot out of the sky over communist countries. And the much better known story is the 1960 shoot down of the U-2 spy plane with pilot Francis Gary Powers. And the Russians did exactly what the Chinese had done 8 years earlier. When Powers was shot out of the sky, he survived. He was fine. And the plane did not disintegrate. And all of his spy equipment was recovered. But the Russians didn't let the world know that. And they waited for the United States to roll out a cover story, which it did. We said one of our weather planes was missing somewhere. And then just at the moment when, again, the United States was claiming, we don't know what this is about, the Russians presented the world with the live flyer and all of his photographic and data gathering equipment, exposing the United States and weakening its moral and legal position. So I think actually the Russians learned something from the Chinese in this. When they watched how the Chinese handled Downey and Fecteau, they saw this was going to be an effective strategy for handling the Powers shoot down.
I was just thinking that, I would say that most Americans probably don't know about Downey's story today. Do you think the same is true for the Chinese? Do you think there's more a memory of this episode on that side?
I think there's an interview in my book between Zhao Enlai and an American journalist many years later, and he refers to Downey and Fecteau as the very famous Downey and Fecteau. The Chinese, they did tell their people through their state media that what was going on. They announced the trial and the confession and the sentencing, and then periodically referred to, you can't deal with the United States because they won't admit the truth about these things. So yes, I think their case was much better known in China than it is in the United States. It's a good question.
Tell us a little bit about Downey's POW experience.
So when he was first shot down, he was taken to a prison in Beijing and was harshly interrogated, although not tortured. He was interrogated every 4 hours. He lied and he lied and he lied, and he embellished his lies with more lies until he couldn't keep it up any longer. And after 13 days, he acknowledged that he was a CIA officer. And then they waited for him to reveal what else he knew, and he came up with a plan that he thought would help stall things, that he would confess everything, but only in writing, not verbally, because he didn't want to get any. And then he had been a wonderful writer in college and had journalistic tendencies. He wrote a 3,000 page written confession, which he filled with all kinds of extraneous information. As he said, if I wrote about somebody, I said, well, I saw him on Wednesday. No, maybe it was Tuesday. No, it was probably Wednesday. He did everything he could to stall and drag out the confession. But after 9 months, he submitted this. And then that was really what led ultimately to his trial and conviction. For the first couple of years, he was desperate for companionship. He felt utterly alone, abandoned. But then maybe 3 or 4 years in, he said, he just pulled himself together and he said, enough of this crap. I'm here. It's, either my government's going to be able to get me out or not, but the job is to just outlast my captors. And he became he was already a very disciplined guy. He had the training, I think, and the physical training, especially through wrestling, to toughen himself up and really deal with this head on. So he became, as he said, the busiest man in Beijing. He ran 10 miles a day, often in place when he was confined to his cell. He did endless calisthenics. He read voluminously. He cleaned meticulously. He, finally he got some privileges, which meant being able to go out onto the cell block and sweep and clean toilets and things. He said as long as he kept himself as busy as he possibly could, he plotted out every single minute of every day, and immersed himself just in the challenge of getting through the day and the night. The days started to roll by into months and into years, and he began to get visits from his mother and his brother. He wasn't completely out of touch with the world. They fell off during the Cultural Revolution because nobody was allowed to travel there then. And he toughed it out. Basically, he had a very strong character, and he concluded that you really couldn't brainwash anybody. Having gone through this, he felt that nobody could get to the inner recesses of his soul. And that gave him a lot of courage and strength. So he made it through, and he was finally released in 1973.
You mentioned his release. Can you tell us how his freedom is finally secured?
Yes. So the Yale class of 1951 would have its reunions every 5 years, and Jack became their catalyst, the man who wasn't there. At the third reunion in 1966, the classmates all got together, and they put it on one of their classmates, a guy named Jerry Cohen, who by that time was a Harvard law professor who spoke Mandarin and was generally regarded as the premier American expert in Chinese law. They put it on Jerry Cohen to figure out a way to get Downey out. It was just at a time when it was possible to begin to have back channel communications with Chinese authorities. And he realized that what the Chinese needed was, if they were ever to release him, that they needed a way to do it where they would save face. So what he proposed was an acknowledgement, an admission, and an apology. Another Harvard professor, Henry Kissinger, was somebody that Cohen knew. And when Kissinger became Richard Nixon's national security advisor, and then later on his Secretary of State, Cohen lobbied Kissinger very hard and said, the only way this can be done is if Nixon is going to make an opening to China, he has to acknowledge and address this issue. So it was from Cohen to Kissinger to Nixon that it was decided ultimately that we would acknowledge that Downey was a spy. And finally, at a press conference at the end of the Vietnam War, which was now January 1973, there were many, many questions about when the POWs would be coming home. And the very last question in the press conference, which was a plant, was, well, what about Downey? He's been in a communist prison for over 20 years. And Nixon said, Downey, as you know, is a different case. Downey involves a CIA agent. And that was the acknowledgement that finally the United States was willing to embrace the truth about Jack Downey and Dick Fecto. By that time, Fecto, I believe, had been released. He was only sentenced to 20 years. So Nixon got away with this very low-key acknowledgement, no apology, just acknowledgement that, yeah, we've looked at this history again, and the truth of the matter is, yes, he was a spy on a secret agent mission. And that began to accelerate the process of getting him home. The Chinese shortened his sentence to 25 years. There started to be communication between Kissinger and Chow En-lai about the condition of Downey's mother, who had a very severe stroke and was in the hospital. And finally, when it looked like she might die without ever seeing her son again, the Chinese released him and they raced him home. And in fact, he got to see her in the hospital, and then she lived another year. But at the time, it looked like she was on her deathbed, and that was the last event that precipitated his release.
Any final thoughts?
I've got lots of final thoughts, but the main one is that this all happened because of a lie. That's why the book is called Prisoner of Lies. If the United States had acknowledged that he was a spy, as we eventually acknowledged that Francis Gary Powers was a spy, they'd have swapped for him. These things, we look at this, the Evan Gershkovich situation today. His trial was supposed to have taken a year. It took a month. I'm not suggesting that Gershkovich is a spy, but all the indications are is the Chinese convicted and sentenced him so that they could swap him. People in Downey's infecto situation normally are valuable for trading for people from the opposite side who their governments want back. But because Downey had been denied and disavowed, there was never, ever an opportunity to trade for him. So he spent probably 15 to 17 additional years in Chinese prison because our government wouldn't acknowledge what he was doing there. That's the lesson.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your research on Downey.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.